What would you exactly do if your own father looked you directly in the eyes and chose a piece of dirt over your entire future? Well, my father did exactly that, and it took me 16 long years to finally make him regret it. Here is how my nightmare began. My name is Sienna. Let me take you back to the exact moment my world was completely shattered. I was just 18 years old, sitting at the massive dining table in my parents' wealthy home. My beloved grandmother Evelyn had legally gifted me a pristine lakeside plot of land. She handed me the legal deed and explicitly told me that it was mine no matter what. But my father Richard was a ruthless and highly successful real estate developer. He did not see a sentimental family gift. He only saw a highly lucrative opportunity for his massive development company. He aggressively slid a land transfer document across the table and demanded that I sign my grandmother's precious gift directly over to him. I looked down at that paper, and for the very first time in my entire life, I bravely refused. I looked my wealthy father in the eyes and I told him no. The consequences of that single word were instantaneous and completely devastating. My father did not just yell at me. He systematically destroyed my life. Within 3 days, he completely canceled my entire college tuition fund. Every single penny he had saved for my education was instantly gone. A few days after that, he stood by the front door and coldly kicked me out of the family home. I was an 18-year-old girl thrown out into the cold world with nothing but a single small suitcase and exactly $50 to my name. He sternly threatened me that if I walked out that door, I was never allowed to come back. And do you want to know the most heartbreaking part of it all? My mother, Beatrice, was sitting right there in the living room. She was casually flipping through a home decor magazine. She watched her husband throw her teenage daughter out into the street, and she did it in absolute silence. She never even looked up from her pages. To protect his own fake high society image, my father Richard maliciously spread vicious rumors throughout our affluent hometown. He lied to all our wealthy neighbors, telling them that I was a terrible delinquent who dropped out of school and ran away just to break my mother's heart. He wanted everyone to believe I was a massive failure. But my toxic family had absolutely no idea the kind of powerful empire I was about to secretly build from the exact ashes they left behind. When that heavy front door clicked shut behind me, I did not cry. I just walked down the driveway to my cheap used car and locked the doors. For the next 2 weeks, that tiny car was my entire home. Have you ever tried sleeping in the back seat of a freezing vehicle while your incredibly wealthy family sleeps in their warm luxury mansion just a few miles away? It completely changes you. It strips away every single illusion you ever had about unconditional family love. But despite their horrifying betrayal, I absolutely refused to let my toxic family destroy my future. I drove far away from that town, and I got a job working grueling double shifts at a greasy diner. I went back to my car every single night, smelling like old bacon grease and bleach. But I carefully saved every single penny. I managed to put myself through community college and eventually earned a full scholarship to get my master's degree in urban landscape architecture. I specifically chose to build landscapes and foundations because I desperately wanted to create things that were deeply rooted. Things that my greedy father could never simply take away from me with a forced signature. When I finally walked across that graduation stage to get my degree, I was completely alone. Nobody came to cheer for me. And unfortunately, my personal life was about to be filled with even more quiet tragedies. Looking for the love and safety I never got at home, I ended up marrying an older man. In public, he was incredibly charming, but in private, he was highly controlling and suffocating. He monitored my bank accounts and isolated me from my friends. He was truly just a smaller and quieter version of my toxic father. I barely survived that dark period, but I finally found the courage to walk away and endure a very painful divorce. But the absolute hardest moment of my entire life happened a year later. I was sitting completely alone in a cold medical clinic, staring at the bright fluorescent lights. A doctor walked into the room and gently told me that I was permanently infertile. I would never be able to have children. I had to process that highly devastating medical diagnosis entirely by myself. I had absolutely no mother to call and cry to. I had no sister to hold my hand. Instead of letting the grief drown me, I took all of that massive pain and I completely transformed it into fierce professional ambition. I rebuilt my entire life from scratch. By the time I turned 34, I had become a top-tier senior designer handling massive eco-resort projects. But I worked strictly under the professional pseudonym S.M. Vance. I completely hid my massive success from the hometown that had callously cast me out. I did not hide my identity to be dramatic. I simply stopped performing for the exact people who had already decided I was a massive failure. I honestly thought I had successfully escaped their shadow forever. But I was entirely wrong. Because one late-night phone call was about to drag me right back into their cruel web. 16 long years had passed since my father threw me out into the cold street. I was now 34 years old, sitting alone in my quiet office, working late into the night. I truly believed I was completely safe from them. I thought my new identity and my new city were an impenetrable fortress. But at exactly 11 at night, on a random Thursday, my phone suddenly lit up. It was an unknown number from my old affluent hometown. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I almost did not answer it, but something deep in my gut told me to pick up. A woman's voice on the other end sounded incredibly careful and highly professional. She told me she was a nurse at an elite care facility and she was calling me an absolute secret. Hearing the next few words made my heart completely stop. She said my grandmother Evelyn had specifically asked her to find me. Grandmother Evelyn was the absolute only person in my entire toxic family who ever truly loved me. She was the only one who ever made me feel like I actually mattered. The nurse took a deep breath and gently explained a terrifying reality. Evelyn was 84 years old, and her health was rapidly declining. She was scheduled for a highly risky heart surgery in exactly 3 weeks. The nurse told me that my grandmother was crying out my name in the dark and secretly keeping my old letters hidden under her pillow like contraband. I immediately grabbed my car keys and told the nurse I was driving down there right that second. But the nurse stopped me. Her voice dropped to a nervous whisper as she revealed a truly sickening truth. My wealthy father Richard had explicitly contacted the facility administrators and strictly banned me from the visitor list. He used his massive financial influence to make sure the security desk would aggressively turn me away. And then she told me his ultimate condition. My father maliciously dictated that I was only allowed to see my grandmother if I agreed to attend the upcoming luxury wedding of my younger sister Clara. Clara was the ultimate golden child, and this wedding was the social event of the decade. Let me ask you to pause and really think about that for a second. Have you ever known someone so incredibly evil that they would literally use a dying elderly woman as a hostage just to force your compliance? He was weaponizing my grandmother's failing heart to drag me back into their toxic web. But my father did not know that my grandmother was still incredibly sharp. Before the nurse hung up the phone, she passed on a desperate and secret warning directly from Evelyn. My grandmother had quietly overheard Clara and my parents plotting in her room when they assumed she was asleep. They were secretly planning a horrific and deeply personal public humiliation for me at the wedding reception. Evelyn wanted me to be fully prepared for the ambush. I sat at my desk completely paralyzed. I had a terrible choice to make. I could stay completely safe in my new hidden life and risk never seeing the only person who ever loved me alive again. Or I could walk directly into a highly calculated trap set by the exact monsters who ruined my youth. But my family entirely forgot one extremely important detail. I was absolutely not the helpless 18-year-old girl they threw away anymore. And if they wanted a war at that wedding, I was going to make sure they lost absolutely everything. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the wall with my heart pounding. I knew I had to go to that wedding if I ever wanted to see my grandmother alive again. But I was absolutely not going to walk in blind. I forced myself to open the email containing the official wedding invitation that my mother had sent me. I started reading the details. I looked at the groom's name. His name was Julian Sterling, and then my eyes moved down to his parents' names. That is exactly when my breath completely caught in my throat. I actually had to read the name 3 times to make sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. The groom's wealthy mother was Victoria Sterling. Let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment where the universe aligns so perfectly that it actually terrifies you? Victoria Sterling was not just some rich socialite. She was the billionaire investor who was entirely funding my current $50 million eco-resort project. For the past 6 months, I had been exchanging countless emails and long conference calls with Victoria. She deeply respected my vision and my architectural designs. She was a brilliant woman, but here is the absolute kicker. She only knew me by my professional alias, SM Vance. Because my firm was located in a different state, we had never actually met in person. She had absolutely no idea what my face looked like, and she certainly had no idea that her highly respected lead architect was actually the estranged and disgraced daughter of the exact family her son was about to marry into. Realizing that my parents and my sister were setting a highly calculated trap to humiliate me, I knew I needed serious backup. I immediately reached out to my closest colleague at the firm. His name is Leo. Leo is an ex-military IT expert, and he is easily the most unflappable and brilliant person I have ever met. I sat him down and I told him absolutely everything. I told him about the cruel nursing home ultimatum and the terrifying secret warning from my dying grandmother. Leo did not even hesitate to help me. Within a single hour, he did some deep research on the luxury wedding venue. He discovered that the local audio-visual company hired to run the projector and the sound system for the reception was desperately short-staffed. By the very next morning, Leo had successfully secured a job as their freelance tech for the main event. He was going to be right there in the room with direct access to the entire projector system and the soundboard. Together, we sat in my quiet office and we secretly prepared our own presentation. I told Leo I did not want to maliciously attack my family. I just wanted the truth to be louder than their lies. We prepared a purely factual and retaliatory slideshow, perfectly showcasing my true life and my actual achievements. We included my master degree, my licenses, and my massive architectural awards. We created an ironclad defense plan. Leo looked at me and promised that if my toxic family decided to fire the first shot, we were going to be completely ready to fire the absolute last. With Leo and our secret defense plan completely locked and loaded, I finally had to fulfill my father's arrogant conditions. Just a few days before the extravagant wedding, I drove to the elite care facility to see my grandmother, Evelyn. My father had strictly mandated that my visit had to be highly supervised. So when I walked into the quiet hallway of the nursing home, my mother Beatrice was already waiting for me. But true to her completely disconnected and cold nature, my mother did not even look up to say hello. She just parked herself in a chair outside the room and started aggressively scrolling on her phone. She told me I had exactly 30 minutes and not a single minute more. I slowly pushed the heavy wooden door open and walked inside. The room smelled like sterile hand sanitizer and old medicine. But the exact moment I saw my grandmother sitting in her chair, my heart completely shattered. Evelyn looked so incredibly fragile. Her white hair was thin and her hands were visibly trembling. But let me tell you, her eyes were just as sharp and fiercely protective as they were 16 years ago. She grabbed my hand the second I sat down and told me how incredibly proud she was of the strong woman I had become. We talked in hushed voices for a few minutes before she suddenly looked toward the closed door to make sure my mother was not watching us. With shaking hands, my beloved grandmother reached under her blanket and pulled out a hidden white envelope. A kind nurse had actually helped her secretly hide it from the facility staff that my father was paying to keep tabs on her. Evelyn pressed the envelope directly into my palms and told me to look inside. Inside that envelope was a thick, folded document. I stared at the heavy paper and the official county stamps. It was the original legally binding deed to the pristine lakeside property. My name was still printed perfectly clear right on the front page. Evelyn leaned in and whispered a shocking truth that made my blood run entirely cold. She revealed that despite kicking me out into the streets 16 years ago, my father Richard had never actually managed to legally transfer the land into his own name. The land was still entirely mine. I sat there, in pure horror, as the massive reality of the situation finally hit me. For over a decade, my wealthy father had been illegally lying to his elite investors and his powerful business partners. He had been falsely claiming that his massive development company owned my pristine acreage. He was actively using my land to secure multi-million-dollar investments, including his upcoming mega partnership with Victoria Sterling. My father was not just a cruel parent. He was committing massive financial fraud. When my mother finally knocked coldly on the door and announced that my time was up, I gently kissed my grandmother's forehead and promised her I would be okay. I walked past my mother in the hallway and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. I came to that facility just hoping to say a peaceful goodbye to the only person who ever loved me. But I left armed with undeniable legal proof of my father's massive criminal deception. The wedding was only a few days away, and my toxic family had absolutely no idea that I was now holding the exact weapon that would completely destroy their entire fake empire. With that heavy envelope containing the stolen land deed safely hidden inside my jacket pocket, I finally walked into the extravagant wedding reception. I already knew my toxic family was planning something terrible because of my grandmother's warning, but seeing it actually unfold in real time was entirely different. My wealthy father Richard had purposely seated me at the absolute worst table in the entire venue. I was shoved way back in the dark corner right next to the noisy kitchen swinging doors. Every single time a waiter pushed through those doors, a massive blast of clattering dishes and loudly shouted orders hit me right in the back. I sat there completely isolated and ignored by my own blood relatives while 200 elite guests drank expensive champagne and celebrated. Then the main ballroom lights suddenly dimmed, and the room grew quiet. My younger sister Clara grabbed the microphone with a wicked grin on her face. She looked directly at my dark corner and excitedly announced to the entire wealthy crowd that they had prepared a special family tribute. The massive 10-foot projection screen behind the head table flickered to life. At first, it showed beautiful and completely perfect pictures of Clara growing up. But then the background music suddenly shifted to a mocking tone and my face entirely filled that giant screen. They had chosen horribly edited and incredibly unflattering photos of me from my absolute lowest moments. Across the very first picture, bold white letters publicly branded me as a high school dropout and a giant checkmark appeared. A sickening wave of nervous laughter actually rippled through the wealthy crowd. I sat completely frozen as the cruel slides just kept coming. The next one showed a cracked heart emoji next to my name and publicly labeled me as miserably divorced. Then an animated empty wallet popped up heavily, branding me as broke. Let me ask you to really imagine this exact scenario. Have you ever had your absolute worst moments and deepest insecurities turned into a highly public joke for hundreds of strangers to openly laugh at? It is a completely paralyzing and deeply humiliating feeling, but the ultimate and truly unforgivable cruelty came on the very final slide. The giant screen faded to black for a brief second, and then a massive piece of clip art appeared. It was a picture of a baby with a massive red X stamped directly over it. Beneath that horrific image was one single brightly glowing word: infertile. My toxic family literally broadcasted my deepest and most painful medical trauma to a room full of 200 strangers just for entertainment. And do you want to know their exact reaction to my public humiliation? My mother Beatrice casually sat at the head table, swirling her expensive wine with a highly satisfied smirk on her face. My father Richard actually smiled and yelled out to the crowd that it was just a joke, and my sister Clara leaned right into her microphone and told the laughing guests not to laugh too hard because I might actually cry. They thought they had finally and completely destroyed me. But they entirely forgot about my IT friend Leo and the secret weapon we had already loaded into their system. I sat there completely frozen in the dark corner of that massive ballroom. My own parents and my sister were openly laughing at my deepest medical trauma. They fully expected me to completely break down. They desperately wanted me to cry pathetic tears and run out the back doors in absolute shame. Have you ever been pushed so far past your breaking point that you actually stop feeling fear and only feel pure clarity? That is exactly what happened to me. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I did not run away. I simply reached into my small purse and pulled out my phone. I already had the text message perfectly typed and waiting to be sent to my brilliant colleague Leo. I looked at the glowing screen, took one massive deep breath, and simply pressed send. The message contained only one single word: begin. Exactly 3 seconds later, the massive 10-foot projection screen completely froze. My sister Clara stood at the head table looking entirely confused as her cruel presentation violently vanished into total darkness. She frantically waved her hands at the audio-visual booth, demanding someone fix the broken system. But she had absolutely no idea that Leo had already completely hijacked the entire projector. He successfully locked my toxic family out of the main system entirely. They had absolutely zero control over what was about to happen next. The giant screen suddenly flickered back to life, but the mocking background music was entirely gone. The horrible photos of me were completely replaced by clean and undeniable facts. The very first slide boldly displayed my official master degree diploma from a highly prestigious university. The wealthy crowd immediately began whispering as the screen quickly shifted again. Next, they saw my official state architecture license, completely proving I was never a high school dropout. Then, the massive screen proudly displayed my high-profile industry awards and my highly respected professional title as a senior lead designer. I was actively designing massive $50 million eco-resorts while my family arrogantly called me broke and worthless. Every single cruel lie they had just told the crowd was completely and meticulously dismantled right in front of their eyes. My father, Richard, immediately jumped out of his chair with his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He frantically yelled at the hotel staff to unplug the projector, but Leo had brilliantly secured the system lock. Then the very final slide appeared on the massive screen. It was just a simple black background with crisp white letters displaying a truly devastating quote. It read, "The measure of a family is not how they celebrate their best, but how they treat their most vulnerable." The entire luxurious ballroom completely fell into a stunned and breathless silence. You could literally hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. 200 elite guests completely stopped drinking their expensive champagne and stared at my family with profound disgust. The tables had finally turned, and my massive silent roar was absolutely deafening. The entire luxury ballroom was absolutely dead silent after my final slide appeared on the massive screen. You could literally hear the quiet clinking of ice in the glasses of the guests. My father, Richard, was the very first person to break that heavy, suffocating silence. He frantically jumped up from his seat at the head table. His face was completely pale with sheer panic and pure fear. He desperately tried to laugh it off to the wealthy crowd, claiming it was just a simple family misunderstanding and a silly joke gone wrong. He aggressively marched over to my dark corner and lowered his voice to a terrifying whisper. He maliciously threatened me, demanding that I sit down and keep my mouth shut before I ruined his massive business merger. But I did not even have to defend myself against his cruel threats. Before I could even say a single word, someone else in the room slowly stood up. I want you to truly imagine this exact moment. I wonder if you have ever had a complete stranger step in to protect you when your own blood entirely failed you. Because what happened next was the most beautiful justice I have ever witnessed. It was Victoria Sterling. She was the incredibly wealthy billionaire investor and the proud mother of the groom. She slowly stood up from the exclusive VIP table, and the entire room watched her every single move. She looked directly at me, and then looked back at the massive screen displaying my prestigious architectural awards. Because we had spent months doing long voice calls and exchanging countless emails, she instantly recognized my professional name and connected all the dots. She realized that the woman my toxic family had just so callously humiliated was actually her elite designer. I was the exact person she had actively hired to build her empire. Victoria walked directly toward my father. With a voice dripping with absolute disgust and terrifying authority, she turned to Richard and publicly dismantled his entire fake reality. She smoothly took the microphone and announced to the entire affluent crowd exactly who I was. She explicitly told the 200 elite guests that the daughter my parents just viciously branded as a pathetic failure was actually the brilliant mastermind architect currently designing the most important $50 million eco-resort project in the entire state. She boldly told the room that my father was a deeply cruel man who had absolutely no idea how incredibly talented his own daughter truly was. I watched the exact moment my parents' carefully curated and entirely fake high society masks completely shattered in real time. My mother Beatrice covered her mouth in absolute horror as her wealthy friends stared at her in pure shock. My father Richard stood entirely paralyzed and completely unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. The powerful business partners he was desperately trying to impress were now looking at him with profound disgust. They finally saw him for the monster he truly was. I stood there looking at Victoria, and I finally felt the massive, crushing weight of 16 years of abuse completely lift off my shoulders. My father thought he could control the narrative, but his entire life was completely destroyed by the exact billionaire he desperately wanted to impress. Standing there looking at Victoria Sterling completely dismantle my father, I watched a man desperately fighting for his very survival. My father Richard was a highly arrogant man who had spent his entire life violently bullying people. But right now he was completely cornered. The massive luxury ballroom was entirely silent. Every single guest was staring at him with profound disgust. Desperate to save his rapidly crumbling reputation and his highly lucrative business partnership with the Sterlings, Richard tried to perform the ultimate pivot. He nervously adjusted his expensive silk tie, forced a highly pathetic laugh, and actually tried to change the entire subject away from the cruel slideshow. He looked directly at Victoria and tried to smoothly shift the conversation back to their upcoming joint real estate venture. He started aggressively pitching the massive development deal on the pristine lakeside property, the exact same land he kicked me out over 16 years ago. He genuinely thought that talking about millions of dollars could just magically erase his massive public cruelty. But my father was completely wrong. This was the exact moment I had been actively waiting for. This was my final and absolutely fatal blow to his fake corporate empire. I stood perfectly still, looked him dead in the eyes, and I calmly reached right inside my jacket pocket. I pulled out the thick, folded legal document that my grandmother Evelyn had secretly handed to me in the nursing home just a few days prior. I held the heavy paper up for Victoria and the entire silent room to clearly see. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady as I explicitly announced exactly what I was holding. I told the elite crowd that this was the original legally binding deed to that exact lakeside property. And then I delivered the absolute, ultimate truth. I explicitly proved to Victoria that the massive mega deal my father was currently pitching to her was entirely built on stolen land. I told the room that my father absolutely did not legally own the property, and he had been actively committing massive financial fraud for over a decade. I want you to really picture the look of sheer, absolute terror on the face of my father. Victoria Sterling is a brilliant businesswoman who values absolute integrity above all else. She looked at the legal deed in my hand, and then she looked at my father with a level of deep, absolute disgust I have never seen before. She was completely repulsed by the massive financial fraud and the sheer breathtaking cruelty of my family. Without hesitating for a single second, Victoria explicitly announced to the entire ballroom that she was immediately killing the massive partnership right on the spot. She firmly stated that she would absolutely never do business with a lying monster. Just like that, his massive, highly lucrative business deal completely evaporated into thin air. But the absolute destruction of my toxic family did not stop with my father. As the massive corporate deal violently collapsed, I watched the horrified groom Julian slowly step away from my sister Clara. He had just watched his brand new bride happily laugh at a slideshow mocking my deepest medical trauma. He had just watched her family get exposed for massive financial fraud. Julian stood there completely paralyzed, intensely questioning the true nature of his new wife. You could literally see the devastating realization washing over his entire face. He finally realized that he had just legally married into a family of absolute monsters. The glamorous wedding reception had entirely turned into a massive public funeral for their high society reputation, and I was the one who finally nailed the coffin shut. As Victoria Sterling firmly declared the end of their massive business partnership right there in the ballroom, the karmic justice was swift and incredibly severe. I watched as disgusted guests completely abandoned the luxury reception in droves. They whispered to each other and walked right out the heavy wooden doors, leaving my toxic family sitting entirely alone in the absolute ruins of their own making. In the following weeks, the consequences for their breathtaking cruelty completely destroyed their fake high society lives. My father Richard watched his entire business empire violently fracture as elite investors aggressively pulled their funding. My mother Beatrice was entirely blacklisted from all her precious country club circles, and as for my golden child sister Clara, Julian actually moved out of her house, forcing her into intense psychiatric therapy to deal with her shattered reality. My father was so incredibly desperate to save his sinking ship that he actually called me begging to buy my lakeside land. I listened to his pathetic panic for a few seconds, and then I coldly and permanently rejected him. By hanging up that phone, I officially removed his absolute last ounce of toxic leverage over my life. I then worked with my own lawyers to secure open and entirely unrestricted visitation rights to my recovering grandmother Evelyn. I completely bypassed my parents and their cruel nursing home rules. I can now sit by her hospital bed and hold her hand whenever I want. If you have listened to my story until the very end, I want you to deeply reflect on the massive journey I took. 16 years ago. I was an 18-year-old girl, violently thrown out into the cold street, with nothing but a single small suitcase and $50. My own family tried to completely erase me, and then they actively tried to publicly humiliate my deepest medical traumas. But instead of letting them break me, I completely rebuilt my life from the ashes and became a highly successful architect. I want you to always remember one profound and undeniable truth. Establishing ironclad boundaries against a toxic family is absolutely never a cruel act of betrayal. It is the ultimate and most beautiful form of self-preservation. You absolutely never have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Thriving in your career and living a beautifully successful life completely unbothered by your abusers is always the ultimate form of revenge. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to protect your own peace, please drop a comment below and tell me your story. Thank you so much for listening. Please hit that subscribe button, and remember to always protect your own light.